Now, today, good news, but also bad news about the cost of living that's pushing a lot of Australians to the brink. Or maybe it was bad and bad, I don't know. I'll ask an expert in a second. The good news is that the Reserve Bank, for the first time in almost a year, decided in its monthly meeting not to raise interest rates, this time to stop inflation. And the government was extremely grateful after having put the Reserve Bank under lots of political pressure to back off.
And we welcome today's decision by the Reserve Bank, but we know that for many of Australians and businesses are struggling with some of those cost of living pressures, higher mortgage payments and things like that. So today's decision was certainly welcome, but we understand for many Australians and businesses, those cost of living pressures remain real.
But what the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. OPEC Plus, the organisation of oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, agreed on the weekend to cut their oil production. And that sent oil prices soaring, and that will hurt motorists here. Joining me is Warren Hogan, Chief Economic Advisor of the Judo Bank. Warren, great to see you again. Now, look, the last time you were on the show, I think you predicted this really. You predicted the Reserve Bank would go weak in fighting inflation. It was talking tough, but it would act weak, you said, after coming under this pressure from the Albanese government. Is that how you see the decision today, taking the foot off the pedal in fighting inflation when the bank really should have kept going?
Yeah, good evening, Andrew. Thanks for having me on the show. I think that's a fair assessment. The RBA is under tremendous pressure not to raise rates. And today, of course, they held off. And this is despite the fact that we have still very high inflation, an economy that's producing jobs, wages are rising, maybe not fast enough for some and certainly not fast enough to keep up with inflation. But all the signs are that the economy is slowing at a very mild pace. But most importantly, the Reserve Bank stands out amongst its international peers. The international benchmark interest rate in the United States is at 5%. They hiked 2 weeks ago, despite having a run on their second-tier banks. The Swiss National Bank hiked 2 weeks ago, the European Central Bank, and all of their interest rates are rising. And in similar economies like New Zealand, Canada, they're all up near 4.5, 5. So it's quite clear the Reserve Bank is doing everything it can to increase interest rates at the least it has to get this inflation down. And that's great. We all hope that they get the job done, but they are leaving us at risk of inflation becoming more entrenched and potentially picking up again down the track. They are signalling further rate hikes, but I think the political pressure, the general commentary that's forcing, telling them how terrible these rate hikes are is showing through in this decision today.
Plus, of course, the government is very publicly telling the Reserve Bank governor, we haven't quite decided on whether to renew your contract later this year. I'm sure he acts from the noblest of intentions, but that's a threat. Now, Warren Hogan, the OPEC decision, explain why they're cutting their oil production and what that means for us.
Well, I think they're worried that prices are falling too much is the simple answer. And they were falling quite a lot earlier in the month, or in March, I should say. So they want to put a floor under the oil price, and they've successfully done that. They've risen about 8% in the last few days. But the prices are only back to where they were a month ago. The issue is how much further do they rise, and are we going to see this again? Most forecasters think the oil price will go up to around $90, $95, and that is not a great outcome because we're actually wanting oil to come off, as it has been for the last 6 to 9 months, to help with this inflation problem, to help bring the cost of living down. This complicates that. But it's not a major lift just yet. But if oil starts going up above $100 a barrel or more, then I think we've got a bit of a problem, given how high inflation is all around the world. And we're actually hoping oil prices coming down would take some of the pressure off and help central banks get the job done on bringing inflation back to their targets of around 2%.
So finally, where do you think we're all going to be by Christmas, the economy?
It's slowing, but it's slowing from very strong rates. Employment's strong, but it'll start to slow as well. I think the real issue is inflation going to come down quick enough? And now what we're seeing in the US is it's sort of stalled at around 5%. It's come down a bit, then stopped. And of course, the big issue is wages, and that's the core driver of inflation going forward. And the ACTU's claim last week for 7%, I think, is a bit of an insight into where we're headed. And So look, I think the economy is actually going to be doing okay, but it's a case of good news on the economy is bad news, because we're not going to get inflation out of the system without the economy slowing. So that's the real issue. I think we're going to see some more rate hikes. The Reserve Bank can't walk away from it completely. I think the real story is whether or not we've got to do a lot more rate hikes into next year and we get a recession later. That all remains to be seen. But at the moment, the economies are holding up pretty well.
Warren Hogan, thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it.